The people who call you worthless are often the ones who fear what you might discover. I spent 23 years believing my family saw me as nothing more than a mistake that refused to disappear. If my father ever looked at me, it was only to compare me to my older brother, Ethan, whose achievements seemed to shine brighter every year while I faded further into the background. My mother never raised her voice or spoke cruel words, but disappointment settled across her face every time my name entered a conversation, as though simply existing had become my greatest offense. They never said they wished I had never been born, yet somehow they never had to. Their silence carried the message well enough. Every birthday dinner ended with another speech about Ethan's promotions, Ethan's investments, Ethan's future, while I quietly cleared the dishes before dessert was served. I became so practiced at disappearing that relatives stopped asking where I was whenever family photographs were taken. They simply assumed I had wandered off, and nobody bothered to look. The only person who ever noticed was my grandmother, Margaret Carter. She had a habit of watching people instead of talking over them. While everyone else admired success, she seemed interested in loneliness. Whenever I visited her small white farmhouse outside Cedar Creek, she greeted me with warm cinnamon rolls fresh from the oven and questions nobody else ever asked. Had I been sleeping enough? Was I still sketching landscapes? Had I remembered to eat lunch? Those ordinary questions somehow mattered more than every expensive birthday gift my parents had ever bought. Grandma never treated kindness like it was something you had to earn. She gave it freely, as naturally as sunlight pouring through her kitchen windows every morning. The farmhouse itself felt frozen in another time. An old grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway, family photographs lined the walls, and the scent of cedar and apple pie lingered in every room no matter the season. I often wondered why she chose to stay there instead of moving into the enormous Carter estate with the rest of us. Whenever I asked, she only smiled and said that some houses remembered too much to ever be abandoned. I never understood what she meant. One rainy Thursday afternoon in October, my mother announced we would visit Grandma because she had missed another family dinner. My father sounded irritated rather than concerned. Ethan barely looked up from his phone. During the drive, nobody spoke except to complain about the weather or traffic. By the time we arrived, gray clouds hung so low they almost touched the fields surrounding the farmhouse. Grandma greeted everyone politely, but I noticed something immediately. She looked tired. Not weak, just watchful, like someone counting minutes nobody else could see. Throughout lunch, she barely touched her food. Instead, she kept glancing toward me whenever my parents weren't looking. Several times it seemed she wanted to say something, but each attempt died behind a careful smile. After dessert, my mother insisted on helping wash dishes while my father wandered outside to answer business calls. Ethan disappeared upstairs, searching for better cell service. Grandma gently touched my wrist. "Would you help me in the garden?" she asked. Her voice remained calm, yet something beneath it felt unusually urgent. We walked slowly through damp grass until we reached the old greenhouse behind the barn. Rain tapped softly against the glass roof while rows of fading roses filled the room with a faint, sweet fragrance. Grandma stopped beside a weathered wooden bench. For a long moment, she simply looked at me, her blue eyes carrying a sadness I had never seen before. Then, without saying another word, she reached into the pocket of her cardigan, folded a tiny piece of paper into my palm, and quietly closed my fingers around it. Her grip lingered just long enough for me to realize this wasn't an ordinary note. Leaning closer, barely above a whisper, she said, "Whatever happens next, don't let anyone know you have this." I slipped the folded paper into the inside pocket of my jacket before anyone returned from the garden, forcing myself to smile as though nothing unusual had happened. During the drive back to the Carter estate, I could feel the tiny square of paper pressing against my chest like it had its own heartbeat. Every few minutes I caught Grandma's final words echoing in my mind. "Whatever happens next, do not let anyone know you have this." She had never spoken to me like that before. She was always gentle, always patient, never mysterious. Yet today there had been urgency in her eyes, the kind that refused to leave me alone. By the time we reached home, evening shadows stretched across the long driveway leading to the mansion. Ethan immediately headed upstairs while my father disappeared into his office without saying good night to anyone. My mother reminded me that several guests would be visiting over the weekend and asked me to help organize the dining room because, in her words, I was naturally better at quiet work than important conversations. I nodded without arguing. It was easier that way. Years of disappointment had taught me that defending myself never changed anyone's opinion. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I quietly locked my bedroom door. My room sat on the third floor beneath the sloped roof, smaller than every other bedroom in the house. My parents called it cozy. I always thought it looked more like an afterthought added to the blueprint at the last minute. Rain continued tapping softly against the window as I reached into my pocket and carefully unfolded the note beneath the warm glow of my desk lamp. I expected a heartfelt message or perhaps advice for the future. Instead, I found something that made almost no sense at all. Across the center of the paper was a strange combination of letters and numbers written in Grandma's elegant handwriting. 7, 12, 3, 19. Below them was a tiny hand-drawn compass with one corner shaded darker than the others. Beneath the drawing appeared only 5 words. The clock remembers what people forget. I stared at the page for several minutes, hoping the meaning would suddenly become obvious. It never did. I turned the paper over. The back was blank except for one tiny pressed forget-me-not flower tucked carefully inside the fold. Grandma loved those flowers. She always planted them beside the old greenhouse every spring because she said, memories deserved a place to bloom. I searched my memory for anything connected to those numbers. Birthdays, anniversaries, addresses, telephone numbers. Nothing fit. Even the compass felt strangely deliberate, as though every mark carried meaning I simply could not see yet. Around midnight, I slipped the note inside an old sketchbook that nobody ever opened except me. I slid the book onto the highest shelf behind several dusty binders, convinced it would be safe there. The next morning, life continued exactly as it always had. My father criticized the coffee for being too weak. Ethan announced another promotion that earned immediate applause. My mother reminded me to pick up dry cleaning because she claimed I had a flexible schedule. Nobody asked whether I had enjoyed visiting Grandma. Nobody mentioned her tired expression. Nobody seemed concerned that she had barely eaten lunch. Their indifference unsettled me far more than the mysterious note itself. 3 days passed, then 4. I considered calling Grandma several times, but something held me back. I could not explain why. It was almost as though I feared interrupting a plan I did not yet understand. On the 5th morning, while watering the flowers outside the kitchen, I overheard my father ending a phone call. His voice sounded unusually tense. "Do not tell Margaret I know," he said quietly. "Not until everything is ready." He turned the corner before noticing I was standing there. The moment our eyes met, his expression relaxed into its usual calm confidence. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. "Just watering the flowers," I answered. He gave a short nod and walked away without another word. I watched him disappear into the house, my pulse suddenly racing. I had never heard him sound nervous around anyone, especially Grandma. For the first time in my life, I realized the folded piece of paper hidden inside my sketchbook might not simply be a puzzle. It might be the only warning I was ever meant to receive. The conversation I overheard refused to leave my mind. My father had always spoken with absolute confidence, the kind of certainty that made board members agree before he finished a sentence. Hearing even the slightest hint of uneasiness in his voice felt like discovering a crack in solid stone. I tried convincing myself I had misunderstood, but every time I replayed his words, they became even clearer. "Do not tell Margaret I know. Not until everything is ready." Ready for what? I found myself watching everyone more carefully over the next several days. My parents continued their routines as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan celebrated another successful business deal and joked about expanding the family investment portfolio. My mother spent hours planning an upcoming charity gala, smiling effortlessly whenever neighbors stopped by. On the surface, the Carter family looked exactly as people imagined us. Successful, respectable, untouchable. Yet beneath that polished image, tiny details began catching my attention. One afternoon, I walked past my father's office and noticed the door standing slightly open. Through the narrow gap, I saw him quickly sliding several folders into a locked drawer just before his attorney arrived. He almost never locked anything inside the house. Later that evening, I heard my mother asking whether all of the paperwork had been finalized. My father answered so quietly that I caught only one sentence. "It has to happen before she changes her mind." Again, no names. Again, no explanation. That night, I pulled Grandma's note from my sketchbook and studied it beneath my desk lamp until nearly 2 in the morning. 7, 12, 3, 19. The small compass. The sentence about the clock remembering what people forget. I traced each number with my fingertip, wondering if I had overlooked something obvious. Then my eyes drifted toward the old photograph hanging above my bookshelf. It showed Grandma standing beside the enormous grandfather clock inside her farmhouse hallway. Suddenly, I remembered something she had once laughed about years earlier. Every birthday, she insisted that clock was the oldest member of the Carter family because it had witnessed more secrets than any living person. At the time, I thought she was only telling another one of her charming stories. Now the memory felt completely different. The following Saturday, I decided to drive back to the farmhouse without telling anyone. My parents believed I was meeting an old college friend for lunch. The sky was bright and clear, and the familiar country roads seemed strangely peaceful compared to the storm building inside my thoughts. As I turned onto Grandma's gravel driveway, an unfamiliar black sport utility vehicle sat parked near the porch. 2 men wearing dark business suits were carrying sealed storage boxes out of the house. I parked several yards away and hurried toward the front steps. One of the men politely stopped me before I reached the door. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I am here to see my grandmother," I answered. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "I am sorry, Miss Carter. Mrs. Margaret Carter checked into a private medical facility yesterday morning." The words landed with surprising weight. "Yesterday?" I repeated. "She never told me she was leaving." The man offered an apologetic smile. "We were instructed to organize personal documents while the family handles everything else." Family. The word echoed strangely. I looked past him through the open doorway. The hallway appeared almost empty. The old photographs had been removed from the walls. Several shelves stood completely bare. It looked less like someone temporarily leaving home and more like an entire lifetime quietly disappearing. As I turned to leave, something caught my attention through the front window. The grandfather clock still stood exactly where it always had. Unlike everything else inside the house, it had not been moved. Sunlight reflected across its polished glass door, revealing the brass pendulum slowly swinging from side to side. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Then I remembered the final sentence on Grandma's note. The clock remembers what people forget. Standing in the driveway with the folded paper hidden inside my pocket, I realized those words had never been poetic advice. They had been precise instructions, and whatever answer Grandma wanted me to find was still waiting inside that silent farmhouse. That evening, I could not stop thinking about the grandfather clock. Every clue Grandma had left pointed back to that quiet hallway, yet strangers were already emptying the farmhouse room by room. If I waited too long, whatever she wanted me to find might disappear forever. I drove back just before sunrise the following morning, hoping the movers had not returned yet. A thin layer of morning fog drifted across the fields, softening the familiar outline of the white farmhouse. To my surprise, the black sport utility vehicle was gone. Only a single pickup truck belonging to the groundskeeper remained beside the barn. Mr. Howard had worked for Grandma for nearly 30 years. He was trimming rose bushes when he noticed me walking toward the house. His weathered face brightened with genuine relief. "Miss Evelyn," he said warmly, "I was wondering if you would come." His words caught me off guard. "You were expecting me?" He lowered his voice before answering. "Your grandmother asked me to keep an eye out for you if you came by this week." My pulse quickened. Did she leave any message? He hesitated for only a second before reaching into his jacket pocket. Instead of handing me a letter, he produced an old brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. "She said you would know when to use it." I stared at the key without recognizing it. "I have never seen this before." Mr. Howard smiled gently. "Maybe not, but she believed you would remember where it belongs." I thanked him and stepped inside the farmhouse. The silence felt different now. Without Grandma humming softly in the kitchen or the smell of fresh bread drifting through the rooms, the house seemed to be holding its breath. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, while the old wooden floor creaked beneath each careful step. Most of the furniture had already been covered with white sheets, but the grandfather clock still stood proudly in the hallway, its pendulum swinging with perfect rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. I unfolded the note once again. 7, 12, 3, 19. The small compass. The sentence about the clock remembering what people forget. Standing directly in front of the clock, I noticed something I had somehow ignored my entire life. For tiny brass stars decorated the wooden frame around its face. One pointed north, one east, one south, one west. The southern star had been polished far more than the others, as though someone's fingers had touched it countless times over the years. I gently pressed it. Nothing happened. I tried turning it clockwise. Still nothing. Then I remembered the compass on Grandma's note. The shaded corner pointed southwest rather than due south. Following that direction with my eyes, I noticed a small carved leaf near the lower corner of the clock cabinet. I pressed it carefully. A quiet click echoed inside the wood. My heart nearly stopped. The lower panel shifted outward just enough to reveal a hidden keyhole. My hands trembled as I looked down at the old brass key Mr. Howard had given me only minutes earlier. It fit perfectly. The lock turned with surprising ease despite its age. Inside the narrow compartment rested a leather journal wrapped in cream-colored cloth, a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting, and a small silver pocket watch that had belonged to my great-grandfather. Beneath them rested another folded sheet covered with rows of letters and numbers almost identical to the code already in my pocket. Before I could examine anything more closely, the sound of tires crunching across the gravel driveway drifted through the open window. Someone had arrived much earlier than expected. I quickly gathered the journal, the envelope, the pocket watch, and the coded page into my shoulder bag before closing the hidden compartment exactly as I had found it. Seconds later, I heard the front door opening, followed by a voice I recognized immediately. It was my father's attorney, and he sounded genuinely surprised. "Evelyn," he called from the entrance hall. I did not realize anyone else would be here this morning. My breath caught for a split second, but years of blending into the background had taught me how to hide surprise. I stepped out from the hallway just as my father's attorney, Daniel Brooks, entered the farmhouse carrying a leather briefcase. He looked at me with polite curiosity rather than suspicion. "Evelyn," he said with a courteous smile. "I was told the house would be empty today." I returned the smile as naturally as I could. I wanted to check on Grandma's plants before they were forgotten. He glanced around the quiet hallway, then nodded. She always appreciated thoughtful people. There was something carefully measured about his tone, as though every sentence had been rehearsed. "Is Grandma doing better?" I asked. Mr. Brooks adjusted his glasses before answering. "She is resting comfortably. That is all I have been authorized to say." Authorized? The choice of words immediately caught my attention. Families usually spoke about loved ones with concern, not authorization. Before I could ask another question, two assistants entered behind him carrying empty archive boxes. Mr. Brooks excused himself and walked toward the study. I thanked him politely and headed for the front door without looking back. Only after I reached my car did I allow myself to exhale. The leather journal, the sealed envelope, the silver pocket watch, and the coded page rested safely inside my shoulder bag. Whatever Grandma had hidden for me, she had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it out of everyone else's hands. I drove to a small lakeside park about 15 miles away where almost nobody visited on weekday mornings. Sitting alone beneath a large maple tree, I finally removed the envelope with my name written across the front. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, steady and elegant despite the urgency surrounding everything else. I carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, then you trusted your own instincts instead of accepting the story others wanted you to believe. That alone tells me I was right to choose you. There are truths inside our family that have remained hidden for many years, not because they were impossible to discover, but because the wrong people controlled the questions. I could not risk explaining everything while others were listening. The journal will help you understand where to begin, but do not read it in order. Start with the pages marked by the pressed flowers. They were placed there for a reason. Above all, remember this: not everyone who appears to protect this family is protecting the people inside it." I lowered the letter and stared across the calm water. The breeze carried fallen leaves across the shoreline, while my thoughts raced faster than ever. Grandma had not left random clues. She had built an entire path, step by careful step, knowing exactly how I would follow it. I opened the leather journal and immediately noticed several pressed forget-me-not flowers tucked between different sections. Following her instructions, I turned to the first marked page. Instead of diary entries, I found neatly organized dates, names, addresses, and handwritten observations stretching back almost 8 years. Every page documented conversations, financial meetings, unexpected visitors, and legal appointments involving members of my family. Grandma had become a quiet investigator inside her own life. One entry immediately stood out. It had been written 3 years earlier. Richard insisted I transfer authority before the end of the fiscal year. When I declined, he became unusually impatient. Ethan appears unaware of the larger plan. Linda knows more than she admits. I turned another page. Attorney Brooks remains professional, but I cannot determine whether he fully understands whose interests he truly serves. Another flower marked a later entry. If circumstances force me away from the farmhouse unexpectedly, the clock will keep the first answers safe. Evelyn notices details others ignore. She will find it. I stopped reading altogether. My eyes lingered on that final sentence until they began to blur. For the first time in my life, someone had written about me not as a disappointment or an obligation, but as a person whose quiet nature was actually a strength. As I gently closed the journal, the silver pocket watch slipped from my bag onto the wooden picnic table. The cover sprang open, revealing an engraved message hidden inside that I had not noticed before. It contained only 6 words, but they changed everything. The second key waits beneath the lighthouse. The words engraved inside the pocket watch stayed with me for the entire drive home. The second key waits beneath the lighthouse. Grandma had never believed in coincidence. Every object she left behind connected to the next piece of a carefully planned trail, and every step seemed to confirm that she had begun preparing long before anyone realized something was wrong. The only lighthouse within an hour of Cedar Creek stood near Harbor Point, overlooking Lake Ashford. It had been retired decades earlier after modern navigation systems replaced it, but the surrounding park remained open to visitors throughout the year. I decided to go the following morning before anyone at home noticed I had changed my routine. That night, I barely slept. I reread several more entries from the journal, searching for another clue that might explain why Grandma trusted only me. One passage caught my attention immediately. People mistake silence for weakness. They do not realize that the quietest person in the room usually notices what everyone else ignores. I closed the journal with a bittersweet smile. Those words described my entire life more accurately than anyone in my family ever had. Early the next morning, I told my mother I planned to spend the day sketching autumn landscapes. She barely looked up from her planner before telling me to be home for dinner because several guests were expected. My father had already left for work, and Ethan was speaking on a conference call while walking toward his car. Nobody questioned where I was actually going. By noon, I reached Harbor Point. The old lighthouse rose above the rocky shoreline, its white paint weathered by decades of wind and rain. Families wandered through nearby walking trails while children tossed breadcrumbs to ducks gathered near the water. It looked like the last place anyone would hide an important secret, which was probably exactly why Grandma had chosen it. I climbed the narrow path leading to the lighthouse entrance. A bronze historical marker stood near the front steps, describing its construction more than 100 years earlier. As I read the plaque, I noticed a familiar symbol carved into one corner of the metal frame. It was the same tiny compass that appeared on Grandma's coded note. My heartbeat quickened. I knelt beside the marker and examined its stone foundation more closely. Near the back, hidden beneath creeping ivy, sat a loose flat rock that looked slightly different from the others surrounding it. I carefully lifted it. Underneath rested a small waterproof metal container no larger than a paperback novel. Inside I found an antique brass key, a folded county map with several locations circled in blue ink, and a sealed envelope labeled, "Only after you find the second key." I smiled despite myself. Even now, Grandma was guiding me one careful step at a time. I opened the envelope first. If you have reached this place, then the journal has already begun answering your questions. You may also be discovering that the greatest danger does not come from strangers. It comes from believing familiar faces cannot keep important truths from you. The next place marked on the map will show you why I documented everything so carefully. Do not confront anyone yet. You still have only part of the story. I unfolded the county map. 3 locations had been circled: the farmhouse, the lighthouse, and the third location was one that immediately made my stomach tighten. It was the downtown office building that housed Carter Family Holdings, the company my father proudly described as the legacy he intended to pass to Ethan one day. Tucked beside the map was a handwritten note listing a date from nearly 8 years earlier. I quickly turned to that same date inside Grandma's journal. The entry was short but unmistakable. Today I learned what Richard has been planning. If the documents are ever needed, the originals will remain where nobody expects them to be. Evelyn deserves the truth when the time is right. I stared from the journal to the map and back again. Until that moment, I had assumed this mystery centered on family disagreements or hidden financial decisions. Now it felt much larger. Whatever Grandma had uncovered 8 years ago was connected directly to my father's company, and she had spent nearly a decade quietly preserving evidence, waiting for the day I would be ready to uncover the rest. For the first time in my life, I walked into the headquarters of Carter Family Holdings without feeling invisible. The downtown office tower had always represented my father's success. Its polished marble floors, towering glass windows, and carefully dressed executives reflected the image he had spent decades building. Growing up, I had visited only a handful of times, usually during holiday events where Ethan was introduced as the future of the company, while I quietly stood beside my mother answering polite questions from strangers who forgot my name moments later. This visit felt entirely different. Grandma's map had led me here for a reason, and I intended to find out why. I entered the lobby just after 9 in the morning, blending easily with employees arriving for work. The receptionist smiled politely and assumed I was there for a meeting. I returned the smile and walked toward the elevators before anyone thought to question me. Grandma's journal mentioned a date from 8 years earlier, but gave no office number, no department, and no obvious direction. Instead, I remembered another detail hidden inside the entry. She had underlined one sentence twice. Originals remain where nobody expects them to be. I repeated those words silently as the elevator climbed. Rather than heading to my father's executive floor, I stepped out one level below where company records, accounting archives, and legal storage rooms occupied most of the building. The hallway was unusually quiet. Framed photographs celebrating company milestones lined the walls, each one carefully documenting the Carter family's public history. As I slowly walked past them, something immediately caught my eye. Nearly every photograph featured my father, my mother, Ethan, business partners, and community leaders. Grandma appeared in several of them as the company's founder emeritus. I appeared in none. It was as though an entire branch of the family had quietly disappeared from the official story. Continuing down the hallway, I noticed an elderly maintenance employee adjusting light fixtures near a storage room. His uniform badge read Samuel. The moment he looked up and saw me, his expression softened with unexpected recognition. "Miss Evelyn?" he asked quietly. I stopped in surprise. "You know who I am?" He smiled warmly. "Your grandmother made sure I would. She said if you ever came looking on your own, I should not ask questions. I should simply tell you that people often hide the truth inside ordinary places." Before I could respond, he pointed toward an old employee library tucked into the corner of the floor. "Nobody goes in there anymore." Then he returned to his work as though the conversation had never happened. My pulse quickened as I entered the small library. Dust covered most of the shelves, and outdated business manuals filled the room. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then I remembered the brass key I had found beneath the lighthouse. Along the back wall stood an antique oak filing cabinet that looked decades older than everything surrounding it. Unlike the modern electronic storage systems elsewhere in the building, this cabinet still used a traditional keyhole. I carefully inserted the brass key. The lock clicked open immediately. Inside rested a single archival document box labeled only with the initials MC. Beneath it lay a digital storage drive sealed inside a protective envelope. I opened the document box first. Every folder contained notarized copies of contracts, board meeting minutes, handwritten correspondence, and certified financial records dating back nearly a decade. Several pages included Grandma's handwritten notes connecting events across multiple years. One pattern became impossible to ignore. Important company decisions had repeatedly been scheduled during periods when Grandma was traveling or recovering from medical procedures, limiting her ability to review them in person. Another folder revealed something even more startling. According to official incorporation records, Grandma had quietly established an independent family trust years earlier. The primary beneficiary was not my father. It was me. I stared at the page, convinced I had misunderstood. Before I could read further, footsteps echoed outside the library door. A familiar voice laughed softly in the hallway. It was Ethan. Another voice answered almost immediately. My father. They were walking directly toward the room, completely unaware that I was standing only a few feet away holding the very documents Grandma had spent years protecting. The voices stopped just outside the library door. Instinct took over before panic had the chance. I carefully returned the document box to the cabinet, slipped the digital storage drive into my jacket pocket, locked the cabinet with the brass key, and quietly stepped behind the tallest bookshelf in the room. A second later, the door opened. I thought they moved these old records months ago, Ethan said with mild curiosity. Most of them, my father replied. The remaining files are scheduled for disposal after legal review. His calm tone sounded exactly like it always had, but after everything I had discovered, every word seemed carefully calculated. They walked only a few feet away from where I stood hidden between dusty shelves. Through a narrow gap, I watched my father glance briefly toward the antique filing cabinet before turning back toward Ethan. There is nothing important left here, he said. Everything that matters has already been transferred. Ethan nodded without hesitation. What about Grandma? He asked. My father paused for a moment before answering. She will eventually understand that the company needs stability, not sentiment. The words settled heavily in the quiet room. There was no anger in his voice, only certainty. It was the certainty of someone convinced he was making the correct decision regardless of how anyone else felt. After another minute, they left the library and continued down the hallway. I remained perfectly still until their footsteps disappeared completely. Only then did I release the breath I had been holding. The digital storage drive felt unexpectedly heavy inside my pocket. Whatever information it contained had been important enough for Grandma to hide separately from every document she had collected over the years. I left the office building through a side entrance and drove directly to my apartment instead of returning to the Carter estate. For the first time since this journey had begun, I needed complete privacy. I closed every curtain, disconnected my laptop from the wireless network, and inserted the storage drive. Several folders appeared immediately. Financial records, board correspondence, personal letters, audio archive. At the top sat a single video file labeled Open Last. Following Grandma's pattern, I resisted the temptation to skip ahead. I opened the personal letters first. Hundreds of scanned documents filled the folder, including correspondence between Grandma and outside legal advisors dating back almost 10 years. Many discussed preserving the family's long-term legacy, but several focused on protecting one specific trust she had quietly established. Every letter confirmed the same fact. The trust had been created independently under her sole authority. No one else could change its beneficiary. I opened another folder containing board correspondence. There I found carefully organized meeting minutes highlighting repeated attempts to persuade Grandma to transfer voting authority over the company. Each request had been declined. In the margins, Grandma had written short observations in blue ink. Pressure increasing. Conversation repeated. Do not sign. The pattern stretched across years. She had recognized what was happening long before anyone else realized she was documenting it. Finally, I opened the audio archive. Most recordings captured routine business meetings, but one file immediately caught my attention because it had been recorded only 3 weeks earlier. I pressed play. Grandma's calm voice filled the room first. I built this company so the family would have security, not so ambition would replace integrity. My father's voice answered respectfully, but firmly. The future requires practical decisions. Grandma replied after a long silence. Practical decisions should never require secrecy. The recording ended there. No raised voices. No dramatic confrontation. Just two completely different visions of what the Carter legacy should become. I leaned back in my chair, realizing something important. Until now, I had believed this story centered on inheritance. It did not. It centered on trust. Grandma had not spent years protecting money. She had spent years protecting the truth behind every important decision affecting our family. My eyes drifted toward the final unopened file marked Open Last. I clicked it. The screen faded to black before revealing Grandma, sitting comfortably in her favorite chair inside the farmhouse, wearing the same blue cardigan she had worn the day she placed the folded note into my hand. She smiled gently into the camera, as though she knew exactly when I would finally see her again. Grandma looked directly into the camera with the same calm expression that had comforted me since childhood. If you are watching this, my dear Evelyn, then you have already proven something I always believed about you. You did not rush toward easy answers. You chose patience, observation, and compassion. Those qualities are far more valuable than power. She smiled softly before continuing. I know you may feel betrayed by people you love. Please remember that disappointment and hatred are not the same thing. Do not let this journey convince you that kindness is weakness. It never has been. She paused and reached for a folder resting beside her chair. Everything you have discovered has already been delivered to independent legal counsel. The records, the trust documents, the board correspondence, and every certified copy have been placed where no single person can erase them. I did not ask you to uncover the truth because I wanted revenge. I asked you because every family deserves at least one person willing to protect honesty when it becomes inconvenient. The video ended with Grandma looking into the camera one final time. Live a life that makes secrets unnecessary. The screen faded to black. I sat quietly for several minutes before closing the laptop. For the first time since this journey began, I understood why Grandma had trusted me. She had never expected me to fight anyone. She simply wanted the truth to survive. 2 days later, attorney Daniel Brooks contacted every member of the Carter family requesting our presence at a special board meeting. The conference room was unusually full. Independent directors, outside auditors, legal advisors, and several longtime executives filled nearly every chair. My father entered confidently beside Ethan, while my mother offered me a polite but uncertain smile. Nobody seemed to understand why I had also been invited. Mr. Brooks stood and calmly addressed the room. He explained that Margaret Carter had activated a series of legally binding instructions prepared years earlier. Certified documents were distributed one folder at a time. Independent auditors confirmed the authenticity of every record. The trust documents were valid. The board correspondence was complete. The preserved meeting records matched official archives exactly. Every important decision Grandma had documented was independently verified. There were no accusations, no dramatic arguments, and no emotional speeches. Only carefully preserved facts presented through proper legal procedures. When the final document was reviewed, Mr. Brooks announced that Grandma's independent family trust would continue according to her original instructions. As its primary beneficiary and future steward, I was entrusted not only with significant family assets, but also with preserving the charitable foundation, employee scholarship program, and community projects Grandma had personally created over the years. My father remained silent for a long moment before slowly nodding. For the first time I could remember, he looked at me without comparison or expectation, only quiet reflection. Ethan leaned back in his chair, visibly surprised. Yet he offered no protest after reviewing the documents himself. Everything had already been verified beyond question. When the meeting concluded, people quietly gathered their papers and left the room one by one. There was no celebration because that had never been Grandma's goal. Outside the building, autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalk as I walked toward my car, carrying the leather journal beneath my arm. A familiar voice called my name. I turned to find Mr. Howard smiling warmly beside a flower bed. Without saying much, he handed me a small envelope that had arrived from the medical facility that morning. Inside rested a single pressed forget-me-not flower and one handwritten sentence. The greatest inheritance is becoming the person who protects others without needing recognition. Months later, I reopened the farmhouse. The grandfather clock still stood in the hallway, faithfully marking each passing hour just as it always had. The kitchen once again smelled of fresh cinnamon rolls every Saturday morning, this time shared with neighbors, employees, and local families who had known Grandma for decades. Her scholarship program continued to help students chase dreams they once believed were impossible, and every spring I planted fresh rows of forget-me-nots beside the greenhouse. Visitors often asked why those tiny blue flowers filled so much of the garden. I simply smiled and told them they were there to help people remember what truly matters. Because in the end, the most valuable legacy my grandmother left behind was never hidden inside a trust, a company, or a secret code. It was the quiet courage to choose truth over comfort, kindness over resentment, and hope over fear, even when nobody else was watching.